July 2nd, 1944. Underground hospital cave near Cherbourg, France. The white medical coat hung loosely on her shoulders as Dr. Schwestern emerged from the subterranean darkness, her hands raised in surrender. She squinted against the harsh daylight she had not seen in days. The Allies cannot possibly have the medical supplies they claim, she had told her fellow nurses only hours earlier. This must be propaganda, designed to break our morale. But those words, spoken deep in the cave hospital, carved beneath the fortifications near Cherbourg, would soon prove to be the first of many shattered assumptions. Behind her, 8 other German army nurses stepped into the sunlight, blinking, hesitant, among the first German nurses captured by American forces during the invasion of France. For days, they had been treating wounded Wehrmacht soldiers by candlelight, rationing their last vials of morphine, boiling and reboiling bandages until the fabric nearly fell apart. None of them knew that within hours they would witness medical capabilities that would contradict everything they had ever been taught about American weakness. The 9 nurses, captured after days of what resembled medieval surgery more than modern medicine, were about to encounter a system so advanced, so abundantly supplied, that it would shake not just their medical understanding, but their entire ideological foundation. Colonel Richard P. Johnson, commanding officer of the 45th Evacuation Hospital at Lam, studied them with curiosity, not hostility. They were enemy medical personnel, but still healers. Within days, they would be returned to German lines under Geneva Convention protocols. A total of 16 German nurses would be exchanged on July 2nd and again on July 9th. But before that, these women would see something that would mark them forever. They would witness American medicine in 1944. Medications they had only heard whispers about. Surgical techniques beyond their training. And the psychological impact would last far longer than their brief captivity. The unraveling had begun more than a year earlier. May 13th, 1943. The scorching heat of Tunisia. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's surrender included not only combat troops, but thousands of medical personnel, doctors, orderlies, and among them German Red Cross nurses, the DRK-Schwestern, who had served with Rommel's Africa Corps through 2 grueling years of desert warfare. Among the captured was Schwester Ilse Schulz, recipient of the Iron Cross Second Class awarded in April 1943. She was one of fewer than 20 women ever to receive this decoration during the entire war. Her colleague, Schwester Grete Fock, also decorated with the Iron Cross, kept careful observations, notes that would later be uncovered in German military archives. She wrote, "The Americans throw away more medical supplies in a day than we received in a month. They have medicines we have only heard about." The scale of the surrender in Tunisia was staggering. Between 250,000 and 275,000 Axis troops laid down their arms, including medical staff from elite divisions, the 21st Panzer, the 15th Panzer, the 90th Light Division. While most of the captured medical personnel were male doctors and orderlies, the nurses among them would experience a particularly profound ideological shock. The Americans processed them with remarkable efficiency. Strict Geneva Convention protocols were observed. At collection points in Tunis, captured medical personnel were sorted within hours. Those needed to treat German wounded were retained. Others were marked for evacuation. Every nurse underwent a medical examination, using equipment that had already become scarce in the Afrika Korps. By June of 1943, the first groups of captured German medical personnel were boarding Liberty ships bound for the United States.
The Liberty ships groaned across the Atlantic, their steel hulls heavy with more than just prisoners. They carried with them doctors, orderlies, and nurses, trained in Germany's finest military hospitals, now reduced to passengers, stripped of rank, stripped of certainty. For the German nurses, it was a surreal journey. The endless horizon of ocean, the creak of the ship's frame at night, and the unspoken dread of what awaited them in America. Propaganda had taught them one thing: Americans were crude, careless, technologically backward. They would have no refined medicine, no discipline, no order. Yet, as the days stretched on, the small acts of their captors began to contradict that story. A guard offering a canteen of fresh water, a medic sharing a cigarette, small kindnesses that unsettled them more than cruelty would have. For many of these nurses, arrival on American soil was the true shock. By July 1943, they stepped onto the docks of Norfolk, Virginia. Processing camps buzzed with efficiency. Their uniforms were taken, their names recorded, their medical roles confirmed. But even as prisoners of war, they were still nurses. Their hands and knowledge could save lives, even if those lives were German. The Geneva Convention ensured their treatment would be humane, but the Americans went far beyond humane. They went into abundance. Inside American Army hospitals, German nurses were confronted with sights they could barely comprehend. Rows of sterile instruments, cabinets overflowing with penicillin, the miracle drug they had only heard about in rumors. At a time when German hospitals in Europe were reusing bandages until the fabric disintegrated, here in America, Supplies were discarded after a single use. Schwester Ilse Schulz, recipient of the Iron Cross, later admitted in interrogation that what she saw was beyond belief. The Americans waste what would save thousands of our men. Meanwhile, the U.S. military made careful use of these medical prisoners.
Doctors and orderlies were often assigned to German POW hospitals, caring for their own countrymen under American oversight. The nurses, too, found themselves working in wards filled with wounded Germans, only now the tools they held in their hands were American. Imagine the shock, administering morphine without fear of running out, using sterile gauze instead of rags boiled thin, performing surgery with electric lights blazing instead of candle stubs flickering in a bunker. For many, it was like stepping a decade into the future. And the comparisons did not stay quiet. German orderlies whispered to each other at night. Nurses scribbled notes, observations that would later find their way into intelligence reports. The Americans had not only bested the Wehrmacht on the battlefield, they had surpassed them in the realm of medicine. By late 1943, groups of German nurses and doctors were spread across POW hospitals in the Midwest and the South. Camp authorities encouraged their work, and slowly something began to happen, something the Nazi regime had never anticipated. The myth of German superiority was unraveling in the very minds of its servants. Not through force, not through propaganda, but through the sight of overflowing medical cabinets, the hum of sterilizers, the calm of American wards where even prisoners were treated with dignity. By the time 1944 dawned, whispers of this contrast were spreading back through German POW channels. Nurses who had worked in Africa, then shipped to America, told their comrades, "We were lied to. They have everything, more than we can imagine." And then came Normandy.
June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy erupted in fire and steel. For the German medical personnel stationed in France, the invasion was not just a military storm, it was the beginning of an unraveling they could not stop. Deep within bunkers, cellars, and underground hospital caves, German nurses worked by lamplight and candle glow. Supplies were nearly gone. Morphine had to be halved, then halved again. Bandages were scrubbed raw, hung to dry, reused until they fell apart. For them, medicine had regressed to something closer to the 19th century than the 20th. When the Allies broke through at Cherbourg in late June, capture became inevitable. Among those taken were Dr. Schwestern and her 8 fellow nurses. They emerged from the underground cave hospital near Cherbourg on July 2, 1944, hands raised, uniforms dirty, eyes wide with fatigue and disbelief.
They had been taught the Americans were butchers, that prisoners would be starved, beaten, humiliated, that their medical skills would be ignored. Instead, what they saw in the American evacuation hospitals left them speechless. Colonel Richard P. Johnson, commander of the 45th Evacuation Hospital at Lamb, was firm but not cruel. He knew they were healers, bound by duty, even if sworn to the Reich. Within hours, the German nurses witnessed supplies that dwarfed anything they had ever seen. Cupboards full of sulfa drugs, tables stacked with clean bandages, sterile operating theaters with overhead lights bright as day. It was another world. For days, they watched American surgeons operate on the wounded, American and German alike. The efficiency, the calm, the sheer abundance of materials left them shaken. One of them confessed quietly to a comrade,
"The Americans cannot possibly maintain this. It must be a trick." But it was no trick. Within a week, those same nurses were escorted back across the lines under Geneva Convention protocols. By July 9th, a total of 16 German nurses had been exchanged. They carried with them not just memories of captivity, but an image that would haunt them long after. The image of America's medical machine, endless supplies, modern drugs, techniques ahead of their time. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the story was very different. Hospitals were collapsing under the strain of Allied bombing. Doctors were pulled to the front lines, leaving civilians with barely trained assistants. Bandages were torn from the dead to be used again. Morphine was nearly gone. And yet, propaganda told them the Reich was unbreakable. For the nurses who had glimpsed the other side, those words now rang hollow. They knew, they had seen the truth. From Tunisia to Cherbourg, from Africa to France, the pattern was clear. Each time German nurses were captured, each time they worked inside American facilities, their assumptions shattered. The United States was not weak. Its soldiers were not crude. Its medicine was not backward. If anything, America was a decade ahead. And that knowledge spread, slowly, quietly, through the ranks of captured medical personnel, through whispers at POW camps, through notes scribbled in secret, through stories told after repatriation. We were lied to. They are stronger than we were ever told. This was the hidden battle of World War II, not fought with rifles or tanks, but with syringes, scalpels, and the hum of sterilizers. A battle of perception, a battle of truth against lies. And in that battle, the Germans were stunned. When the German nurses returned to their homeland after Cherbourg, they carried more than uniforms and weary faces. They carried knowledge, dangerous knowledge, that could unravel the fabric of Nazi propaganda. They had seen the truth with their own eyes. At first, they tried to remain silent. They knew what could happen if they spoke too freely. In Hitler's Reich, even whispers could lead to prison, or worse. But human beings cannot unsee what they have seen. At night, in bunkers lit by flickering oil lamps, some would confess to one another in hushed tones. The Americans have drugs we don't even dream of. They operate without fear of running out of morphine. Their hospitals are clean, like new. The contrast to Germany's crumbling system was unbearable. By 1944 and 1945, inside the Reich, hospitals resembled shadows of their former selves. Supplies were nearly gone. Doctors had been drafted into combat units, leaving young women and aging surgeons to handle wave after wave of wounded. Bandages were stripped from corpses. Surgical instruments were dull, barely sterilized. The air reeked of rot and desperation. Yet still propaganda broadcasts declared, "The German Reich remains strong. Our enemies are collapsing." But the nurses knew otherwise. They had seen American strength with their own eyes. One nurse, years later, recalled in her memoirs, "When I stepped into the American hospital, I thought I had stepped into the future. Everything was bright, everything was clean. They treated their wounded like treasures. I felt ashamed of what we had been told and of what we could not give our own boys." Her words echoed a sentiment felt by many who had crossed those lines. Imagine the weight of that knowledge. You return to your homeland, where every window rattles with the thunder of Allied bombs, where food is scarce, medicine scarcer, hope nearly gone, and yet you remember the Americans with cupboards full of sulfur powder, with operating rooms lit like daylight, with calm surgeons working through the night. How do you reconcile such a difference? For many nurses, the answer was silence. They buried the truth deep inside, waiting for a day when the war would end and speaking would not mean death. But silence does not erase memory. By late 1944, as the Allies pushed into Germany itself, the truth became undeniable. Soldiers returning from the front spoke of American abundance. Civilians whispered about the leaflets dropped from the sky, showing images of food and medicine. And those few who had witnessed it firsthand, like the nurses from Cherbourg, knew it was not just propaganda, it was reality. The Reich was not invincible. The Allies were not primitive. The war was lost. For those German nurses, the war had taught them something far deeper than medicine. It had taught them that truth can cut sharper than any scalpel. And once truth is seen, it cannot be forgotten. As the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the world exhaled. Cities lay in ruins, families shattered, nations forever scarred. But among the rubble were memories. Memories carried not just by soldiers, but by those who had served behind the lines. For the German nurses who had seen the American hospitals in Cherbourg, the war left them with more than sorrow. It left them with perspective. They had walked through the heart of their enemy's system and discovered humanity there. They had been told that Americans were crude, weak, and inferior. Yet what they saw was compassion, science, and a kind of order their own collapsing Reich could no longer maintain. One nurse would later whisper to her granddaughter, decades after the war, "I thought I knew who the enemy was, but in those white tents I saw no hatred, only care. I realized then that the lies we had been told were the true poison." The Battle of Cherbourg became just one line in the long chronicle of the war. But for those who had been there, it was unforgettable. A moment when illusions shattered. A moment when truth, bright, sharp, undeniable, broke through the fog of war. And as history marched forward, those truths spread quietly, whispered in kitchens, passed through generations, reshaping how even the defeated came to see their enemies. War is fought not only with guns and bombs. It is fought with ideas, with lies, with the fragile hopes of ordinary people. And sometimes the greatest weapon of all is simply the truth.
If you've stayed with me through this journey, through the hospitals, through the ruins, through the memories, then I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. If you enjoyed this story, if you felt the weight of history in these words, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing these forgotten voices back to life. And don't forget to like this video if the story touched you. Share it with someone who still believes history should be remembered, not just in dates and battles, but in human voices, in the whispers of those who lived it. Until next time, keep remembering, keep listening, and never forget the lessons the past still has to teach us.